I don't have to, because what I want to do today is take a little break from the sequence that we've been doing and talk with you about Lao Tzu. I got into it. I started writing an outline. I have the outline, such as it is. With your permission, granted that I don't choke to death, to read you what I wrote and then talk a little bit about it. As I was working on it in the middle of the night, it dawned on me that this is one of the key moving parts of an intellectual mechanism that we think of when we talk about the roots of Chinese medicine. When we talk about understanding the theory and the use of theory, how to apply theory in the Chinese medicine clinic. The remark sometimes you hear in the halls of academia more and more, you have to understand the thinking of Chinese medical doctors. Well, to understand the historical modes and models of thinking, you have to come to terms with Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu is a pillar of Chinese thought. That's not to say that Chinese thought is predominated by Taoism. It certainly isn't, but it's permeated by it. Taoism over the centuries, over the millennia, has been one of those schools of thought, we call them, which has, because it features and emphasizes softness, it's very good at penetrating things. You know how easy the soft penetrates. Water, formless, can flow right through walls. If it meets something that it can't go over and can't go under, it'll just sit there until it can go through it. Taoism has taken the movement of water as its ideal. Well, since Lao Tzu, you find those metaphors throughout the text. But it dawned on me, it's really key to the Chinese medical introduction that we familiarize ourselves with this way of using the mind. So, bear with me. So the first point on my outline is I'll just read it without trying to edit it. Having made it to old age, I find that I want to define themes for my remaining time here on earth. Above all, I notice that I wish to be obedient. Mom, Jessica, asked that I write a commentary on the Tao Te Ching. Here it is. Before undertaking commentary on the words, phrases, and passages of the text, we should consider the work as a whole. The text exists within a fecund matrix of ideas and expressions that warrants close examination. We encounter in Chinese literature a dense aggregation of thought about the enduring conundrums that seem to have always occupied human minds. Who are we? Where do we come from? What are we doing here? Should we be doing something else? The Tao Te Ching is a pillar of Chinese and indeed human literature. It has been read and translated as a manual of ancient statecraft and as a primer of Taoist moral and ethical thought by scholars steeped in the literary and academic traditions of the so-called Abrahamic religions. Oh, I'm happy to see you. So where was I? By scholars steeped in the literary and academic traditions of the so-called Abrahamic religions, it has been afforded a biblical status, but it is something a bit different. It is a prime example of what is known in Chinese as Jing. I will discuss the meaning and implications of Jing presently, but I will first point out that this commentary is based on a somewhat different reading of the text than the one I have described. I see the text as an early attempt to codify mind and thereby put into the hands and minds of descendants the knowledge required of those who possess and use minds.
I'm a little lost because I came in the middle. What is that referring to?
The Tao Te Ching.
Okay, and those were lines from the Tao Te Ching you were reading, or a reference to the Tao Te Ching?
I wrote this last night.
Okay.
So it's a reference to the Tao Te Ching.
Okay.
It dawned on me while working on this last night that it's really kind of pivotal in our attempt to understand the Chinese medical theory, how to think it, how to use it, how to apply it. So it's kind of gotten itself added. The next section is called The Literary Context and General Character. The Chinese have long been a literary people. No doubt a substantial fraction of the historical billions of Chinese have lived and died illiterate. But even for them, the stain of ink has proven indelible, not to mention the undying echoes of the vast array of oral traditions and transmissions that have thrived throughout Chinese culture. Now, that little bit of text that I just read is all that I actually got composed. The rest of my notes here are all in outline form. So I'm going to go through the outline. I'll read out the whole outline, and then I'll just kind of work through each section. 1.2 is the nature and character of the classics, Jing. And this is the promised discussion about Jing as literary classic, and how that compares to and importantly differs from the notion of sacred texts that we have associated with works like the Bible and the Quran, how the proper reading of the text requires that we understand this framework, that the framework is not the same as a biblical text. 1.3 concerns Jing as regulation. 1.4 concerns Jing as the transmission of vital essence. And that's divided into two subsections. A vital report about what has worked in terms of knowledge and technique in any given field, and what can be depended on. Just briefly, before I go into it more deeply after having read the whole outline, what the Jing accomplishes at UCLA, I think it's Royce Hall, there's an inscription chiseled into the wall that's attributed to Clark Carr, who was the first, what's the name of that office that runs the UC?
High Mucky Muck.
Chancellor. But I like High Mucky Muck. Anyway, it says, education is learning to use the tools that the race has found indispensable. This is, if you embrace that concept, this is what the Jing is. The Jing is the transmission from one generation to the next of knowledge about the tools we use and the methods we use to use them. And only that which is indispensable, necessary for survival. The next section discusses literary aesthetics, and there are 3 subsections. The first one is to treat a large amount of information as if it were a small amount of information. The next 1.5.2 is never point your finger at the moon. And 1.5.3 is the written word as art. And certainly it's not unique in world literary traditions and world artistic and aesthetic traditions to venerate and relate to word as art. But the Chinese pursuit of this notion really is awe-inspiring. You know, it's a very common thing in Chinese houses to see even one word hanging on the wall. And at the art auctions, a work like this from the right brush is worth millions of dollars. So somewhere at work in that society is a value structure in which word as art is placed very high. Then I get into talking about the character of the text, meaning the character of the text of the Tao Te Ching. At this point, I've inserted a little note on textual scholarship and the fact that if you ask yourself, what is the Tao Te Ching? Once you become familiar with its literary textual history, you realize that this is a work that has been being compiled, recompiled, edited, transmitted published, republished, revised, reissued, constantly for thousands of years. Therefore, one is hard-pressed to say, what is it? Because in one era, it's one thing. In another era, it's another thing. And if you take the viewpoint of looking at this long and variegated tradition with the aim of finding the right one, I think you're going to get a headache. I think rather it's important to start out with the idea of we don't have to like or promote or support diversity. It's diverse. There's lots of different versions of this text. And the fact is that as archaeologists continue doing their work, new versions continue to come to light. And every time it comes out of the ground, it's just a little different than the last one. Sometimes the last one was earlier, sometimes the last one was later. It's reflected and becomes more distinct as more examples come from the work of archaeologists, is that this is a text that scholars have been reconsidering for a long, long time. Now, what lies behind the reconsideration? Mistakes, certainly. People change their mind. People think, Lao Tzu, who wrote this a few hundred years ago, was smart, but not smart enough, so now I'm going to make it right. You know, there's been all kinds of forces, intellectual forces that come to bear. But that's just a little note that needs to be inserted, that in my comment, I'm not really trying to approach the subject of authenticity or veracity or correct version of the text. I take rather as given that I have developed an understanding of what the text says based on my experiences with it, with my teachers, with the text itself in the versions that I have seen, and that's all I can do. I will then talk a little bit about, I mentioned in that little bit of introduction that I read, that the text is often read as a manual of statecraft, how to govern. And sometimes it's read as a manual of morality and ethics, how to behave. So I will give a few historical examples of English translators and the spin that they've put on the text coming from these particular points of view. And again, the reason I'm doing that is to make my point, which is that I see it as an early attempt at an owner's manual for the human mind. That it represents a kind of proto-cognitive science, a science of origins. Where does the mind come from? A science of methods. How do you use it? I also see it as a cosmological map. It talks not just about consciousness, but about the universe as a structure, and as a kind of ontological schemata. Like it's a schemata, you know, like if you go to build a radio, you get a schematic diagram.
Oh, okay.
That shows where the components go and how they interconnect.
So an ontological schemata would be what?
Such a diagram that shows you how to exist. What are the component parts of existence? And how do they relate to each other? As such, what it represents or what it is a fundamental look at the patterns of the natural world. One of the key features in the literary tradition of which it is an important part is the Book of Changes. The Book of Changes is the oldest of these Chinese classics. What is the Book of Changes? It's the essence of this look at the fundamental patterns of the natural world. That's what yin-yang is. Yin-yang is a statement that says, well, we have considered the evidence and here's what's happening. Things are empty, then they're full. When they're full, they then empty. When they're empty, they then fill. That's how it goes, folks. Thanks for asking. What follows then is the beginning of a list, which is where I think I passed out, which is to introduce and define some of the basic terms. Dao, De, Jing, Wu Wei, Xu, emptiness. The list will go on, but probably not to more than about a dozen terms. That's what I did last night.
You were obedient.
Well, I spent so much of my life as imbued with this feeling of rebel, like my son. My son shows this part of me to myself. All you have to do to provoke a no is say yes. Does anybody want to comment or question anything about that bit of outline? So this then is, I imagine that when this is all composed, it will constitute maybe 20 or 30 pages. And it will be the front matter, the introductory matter to a collection then of commentaries on the individual chapters of Lao Tzu, which I'm actually kind of excited to be doing because, I'd kind of lately I've been focusing on this class, and as Jess was leaving yesterday and she said this to me, I thought, that's really important. Okay. So let's talk about Jing.
With a J.
Yeah, J-I-N-G. Jing is important to us from two perspectives. One is the one that I've just been talking about, sneaking up on understanding how the Chinese mind space operates. But a specific manifestation of that is the map we call Jinglo, the channels and the network vessels. In the study of manual therapy, acupuncture and such, we are completely constrained by this map. And it's certainly noteworthy that the operative term in both contexts is one and the same, Jing. So what does it mean? First and foremost, it means regulation. Now, because of a disparity in the notion of parts of speech that exists when comparing English and Chinese, we can't really look at classical Chinese words as distinct nouns or verbs or modifiers. The tendency of ancient Chinese words, or the potency, let's say, of ancient Chinese words, is that they maintain their capacity to function as almost any part of speech, given the context in which they're used. And here I'm reminded of that great insight that's conveyed in the title of Bucky Fuller's autobiographical work, I Seem to Be a Verb. Well, the Chinese language bestows upon its users a kind of inbred sensitivity to that condition. We seem to be verbs. We're actions. We're processes of change. We're not static things. As the noun structure has a little bit of a tendency to try to convince us that we are, that you are you and I am me, and the desk is an object, and of course, to this perspective of objectification, the truth of modern quantum physics, for example, seems revolutionary and mind-blowing. But to an awareness that sees nouns and verbs in much more liquid form, one flowing smoothly and uninterruptedly into the other, oh, that makes perfect sense. The quantum view, I think it was not Schrödinger, but one of those early European physicists, I don't remember who now. Anyway, he was lecturing in Japan in the 1930s and lecturing about quantum mechanics. And unlike audiences in Europe, his Japanese physicists, their response was, of course, naturally, thank you for making this so clear. And afterwards, maybe, no, can't remember who it was. Whoever this German, I think, scientist was, went to one of his hosts and said, you know, my European colleagues reject what I say out of hand. They think it's foolish and nonsensical. But I notice a tremendous receptivity amongst your colleagues and yourself here. What do you make of that? And the answer came back, our minds were never corrupted by Aristotle.
And what did Aristotle do that was corrupting? He was tending to, how did that happen? What happened?
The positing of a value system that sees opposites as opposites rather than as co-creative, mutually embracive onenesses. You know, it gets down to a religious distinction. And by religious, I'm back again to the consideration of origins. If you ask, where does all this come from? And in the most sincere way, not lightly, but needing to know. There's a certain result obtained from nominating a source and a vector of creation that leads from universal cause to oneself. This is the idea of monotheistic Abrahamic religions, that the universe, as Alan Watts put it, is a ceramic object. It's a created thing. Like the potter throws a pot on the wheel, like the carpenter builds a house, so did God create the universe. And it lends a kind of shape to the universal vector. Now there's a different result obtained from looking at the same circumstance and seeing, oh, what we observe in the natural world is everything is cycling, everything is turning. Things leave the sky and they come back to the sky. Lightness comes and lightness goes. Warmth comes and warmth goes. As the I Ching says, over and over, coming in and going out with no blame. There's a completely different feeling given to the notion of origins. That's what I mean by a religious difference. You know, the Chinese were so lax in their sense of interpretation of origins that they didn't have religion. What they had that stands in the place of religion in the Abrahamic traditions, it was a sense of ancestral worship, ancestral veneration, so that the temples that existed within households. It wasn't until the Buddhists arrived in the first century that the Chinese really began to form religious sects and cults of something other than and in addition to Buddhism. The first Taoist cult formed in 2nd century.
Mao
Before.
Before.
Udomi, Qingchen. Let me look at my notes. Oh yeah, we're supposed to be talking about Jing. So, the notion of Jing is based upon a feeling. When you live close with nature, you get taught in very unquestionable ways that the power of survival is with nature, not with yourself. And that survival strategies must include adapting oneself to this natural power. When we get around to discussing the word de, as in Tao Te Ching, we come again to this notion of the construct of natural power. How do you regulate human behavior so as to bring it into a proper adaptation to this natural power? The answers to that question is what flows through the Jing. How does the body regulate itself so that the changes of the internal and the changes in the extremities mutually communicate, interact, and benefit each other? The answers to that question is what flows through the Jing of the Jinglo. In this sense, the meaning of the word in both contexts is the same. It means the movement pattern of the regulatory principle. That's what is the Jing. The reason for this, of course, is so that the body can continue to function, continue to operate. This is another meaning of the word Jing, doing business. When Chinese shops are open, they hang a sign in their window that says Jing, doing business. So the word means normal. It means functioning, operating. Any questions about Jing?
Maybe just a mention of the components of the character itself, the silk with the warp and work.
Etymology. Yeah, in the notes, it's in here somewhere. Yeah, look at number 12.3. You see the term Jinglo. What the components of that character Jing are is the left-hand side is the silk radical. And what the silk radical tends to mean when used as a component in words is interconnection. the right-hand side is another word, Jing, which means watercourse. And watercourse is an interesting word. It's a word that defines, distinct from a river, the pathway of the river. And includes an awareness that rivers that are visible as features of surface anatomy often exist below the ground as well. And that the watercourse is a trend or tendency of water to flow through a certain given region. So Jing as a word then, in ways that Chinese words magically do, combines these two verbal notions into one. And what we get as a basic root meaning of the word is a pathway of movement that serves to interconnect. And indeed, that's just what we've got in both the Jing of Jingluo and the Jing of the literary classics. In the literary classics, we're connecting the generation of the teacher with the generation of the student, thus ensuring the survival of the body politic. In the instance of the Jingluo, we have the connection of the internal organs with the extremities, a connection of the qi of the living creature with all of its parts, thus ensuring the survival of the body. Thank you.